Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all very much for coming to Penang Institute. My name is Fawaz Abdulaziz. I'll just make the introductory remarks before I give the floor to the more interesting people of the evening. Okay, this forum called "Shedding Light on the Invisible: Understanding Refugees and Displacement in Malaysia." This forum is a joint effort of the Penang Institute, as well as the Consortium on Forced Migration, Displacement, and Education, CFMDE, as well as the Andrew Mellon Foundation. The CFMDE started at Vassar College in the US and has since been joined by Bard College, Bennington College, and Sarah Lawrence College. This forum sets out to explore the layers of complex experiences faced by refugees in Malaysia. As this country, as you know, this country is still in the midst of negotiating the issues and challenges of refugee management, and amidst an absence of legal recognition for these displaced communities. So joining us today in conversation is University of Illinois lecturer, Dr. Valeria Bonatti. First, I'd like to explain that Dr. Parthiban Muniandy was supposed to be the moderator for this evening, but unfortunately, he fell sick. He started feeling sick early this morning, I think, and then his fever got a bit worse. But fortunately, we have Dr. Valeria Bonatti, actually Dr. Muniandy's better half, but who's might be a better replacement for this forum. And Dr. Bonatti will be facilitating the discussion with Malaysian activist Heidy Quah and Afghan refugee activist Amir Hossein, as Amir and Heidy share their insights into and experiences of the realities of refugee life in Malaysia. Okay, after that introduction, I think I'll introduce the moderator and the speakers first before I give the floor to Gareth for a few words. Okay, I'll give the floor to Gareth Richards, who will have a few words, like to speak a few words.
Thanks. For the first time, they haven't got me up here. I can just sit in the audience, feel entertained, and ask nasty questions. I'm being very rude to beg the microphone to make an announcement. We're doing a lot of events for the Georgetown Festival, which begins on July the 15th. But I do want to draw your attention to one event in particular. It's going to be the literary highlight of the year. We're bringing Tan Tuan Eng to Penang, back home, on Wednesday, the 26th of July. And he'll be appearing in conversation with Karina Robles Baharin, the winner of the Epigram Books Prize for 2022. So they're going to be in conversation, they're going to be readings and so on. Now, here's the thing. The tickets are free. We put them out via email and by social media 3 days ago. We had 250 tickets. There are fewer than 60 left. You can only come if you have a ticket, but it just means making a small effort to come to the bookshop or pick up the phone and call us or send us an email, okay? And we've had experience before when people have shown up without a ticket and whatever, who actually go things like, "Don't you know who I am? I'm the son of Dato' Anwar Faisal." So honestly, I mean, you could actually even leave your name with me tonight and I make sure, but a number of people in the room have already booked. So just to repeat, Tan Tuan Eng in conversation with Karina Baharin, Robles Baharin, Wednesday the 26th of July in the Majestic Theatre, and it will be majestic.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Okay, so on to our event. Let me introduce the moderator and the, the speakers for the evening. The moderator, Dr. Valeria Bonatti, has a PhD in sociology from University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Champaign, is that how? Okay. Where I worked as an instructor, where she worked as an instructor of global studies and sociology. Her teaching and research areas include globalization, the environment, global health, migration, and gender. Prior to rejoining the University of Illinois in 2018, she taught at Bard College, as well as for the Bard Prison Initiative. She's based both in Illinois and in New York State. As for the panelists, let me introduce the Heidy Quah first. Heidy Quah was born and raised in Damansara Jaya, Selangor. She first, while she was still studying, she volunteered as an English teacher at a refugee school in Kuala Lumpur, while undertaking her undergrad in accounting and finance. In 2012, if I'm not mistaken, 2012, she established Refuge for the Refugees together with a close friend. Um, for that, she studied Burmese and Chin in order to be able to better communicate with the refugees. Refuge for the Refugees works to provide basic essentials such as education, healthcare, and vocational and entrepreneurship training. They also rescue refugees from detention camps as well as human trafficking syndicates. Last year, Quah joined Pink Collar Employment Agency, a social enterprise in Malaysia providing ethical recruitment services to hire migrant workers and advocating for better labor conditions for migrant workers in Malaysia. Quah was the first Malaysian woman to receive the Queen's Young Leader Award. Amir Hossein hails from Afghanistan and has been residing in Malaysia for the past 7 years. He's a second-generation refugee. He currently serves as a current director of the Afghan Community Center Malaysia, based in Selangor. Aside from his passion in community development and volunteering, Amir also has interests in business development, artificial intelligence and innovation, and also developing his skills in organizational leadership. We all hope, we all pray that Amir, who's gotten accepted into Columbia University in New York, is able to join and pursue his degree in computer science in fall this year. So with that humble introduction, let me call upon Dr. Bonatti, Heidy, and Amir to come to the stage. I'll give the floor to Dr. Bonatti.
Sorry, where are we? Okay.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that kind introduction. So the first question that I have for our speakers, for the actually interesting and inspiring people here on this podium, is you're both inspiring figures, people who are doing amazing work in support of refugees and support of migrants. Would you like to share with us about your story and what led you to do the work you do?
Yeah. Do you want to start first, Amir?
Obviously, ladies first.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I think my journey started back in 2011, 2012, right after I went to a government school in Damansara Jaya, SMK Damansara Jaya. My closest circle of friends in school were public speakers and debaters, and every day after school, we'll gather around our canteen and talk about issues happening in the world, being angry about what our government is not doing enough of, what NGOs are not doing enough of. And one day it dawned on me, look, there I was sitting being angry, being an angry teenager. Sounds pretty typical, right? Being an angry teenager, pointing fingers about what people are not doing enough of, but what am I actually doing? So right after secondary school, I had a couple of months before I started college when I decided to ask around for volunteering opportunities. At that point of time, I was pointed to a refugee school in the heart of Kuala Lumpur that needed English teachers. And I thought, hey, why not? I'll go in and teach for a couple of months. I went in really with intention to change lives, to make a difference, to impact communities, only to realize that my world was turned upside down when I started teaching in these communities, in realizing that, first of all, refugees exist in Malaysia. I couldn't comprehend how the students I was teaching were just a couple of years younger than me, yet lacking access to education or just basic human rights here in Malaysia. So a few months into teaching, I found out that the school had to be closed down due to lack of funds, just in time as I was about to stop volunteering to pursue higher studies. Coming from a typical Asian family, my parents told me that I couldn't juggle both at the same time. I need to focus on my studies, and so that was the intention. But when I found out that the school had to be closed due to lack of funds, I decided that, hey, you know what? I need to fundraise for the school. So Refuge for Refugees started first as a project, going around trying to fundraise for the school, washing cars and doing gardening at 16, 17-year-old, only to realize that as we're having conversations with the locals, people staying in Malaysia, Malaysians did not know that refugees existed in Malaysia in the first place, right? Malaysians couldn't tell the difference between refugees and migrants. There were little understanding around these topics. And so we decided that in order to do effective work, Refuge for Refugees had to be more than a project. It had to be something long-term, and that's how Refuge for Refugees was started. So I've been doing this for the past 10, 11 years now, since 2012.
Thank you.
Well, I already feel the pressure
No.
sitting next to the one and only Heidy Quah. But my journey with community work and volunteering started about a couple years ago, where I started teaching English to adults in a refugee-ran school. The school provided elementary education for refugee kids in the mornings, and we used to have English classes for adults in the afternoons. We started with one class. I still remember it was 5 to 6 p.m. And this was the time where I was still pursuing my high school studies. So I would be studying myself from morning until around 4:30. I would get home at around 4:50 and quickly change, get to the school and start a class. I was a volunteer teacher with that school for about 3 years. While simultaneously completing my high school studies. After that, I had to take a break due to personal reasons, but I was still, I would say, partially active, helping with translations, interpretations here and there for the communities. Because again, one of the main issues that refugee communities face in Malaysia is that language barrier, that gap that exists. Up until about earlier this year, where I was suggested to take over the role for the director of the Afghan Community Center, which seemed pretty scary at first, but we have been able to initiate a few exciting programs, which I find very exciting. And it has been, I would call it, an uphill battle, but it's been absolutely fun.
Yeah.
Thank you. So glad to learn more about both of you. So my next question is, and again, feel free to take turns, but both of your work has a strong emphasis on education. Would you like to tell us more about your experiences and the challenges that you've seen the communities that you respectively work with facing in accessing education, and even more so in securing, I hate the term upward mobility, but a better life through their education, given the many difficulties that refugee communities face everywhere in the world, including in Malaysia?
As Nelson Mandela puts it, education is the best weapon you can have to build a better future. But unfortunately, Malaysia, being the beautiful country that it is not a signatory to the 1951 UN Convention. And what that means is that the government does not recognize certain rights, one of which is access to education. Now, I think the importance and the significant effect that education can have on one's life is clear to all, even if that person is not a refugee per se. But unfortunately, that access to education is very limited for refugees. Now, at the moment, there are a few refugee schools that provide elementary education for refugee kids across Malaysia. But unfortunately, as you go higher the educational ladder, as you go up to the secondary, high school, pre-university, and undergraduate studies, these options tend to become less and less and less. And I think, again, one of the, in my opinion, as someone who has a deep and great passion for education and sees education as the primary way or primary vehicle for upward social and economic mobility, I think there is still, I believe, some work to be done.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just to also speak into that a little bit more, right? Refugees currently support about a network of 35 community-based schools. Because refugees in Malaysia do not have access to, can't go to formal school, a lot of times they go to this, what we call community-based schools that are set up by the community for the community, right? And a lot of times when we look into the struggles of refugees accessing education, it's not just affordability, right? It's looking into our transport system. I mean, like public transport in Malaysia is not integrated enough. And a lot of times, to travel from Kajang to Pudu, for example, what would take typically 30 minutes by car would probably take you about an hour and a half or an hour to 45 minutes by train and by public transport. And a lot of families struggle to even afford private transportation to school. So I think we look into several issues in just challenges refugees face in trying to access education. First of all, it's just how inaccessible education is in general. Formal education is very limited for refugees in Malaysia. That's why a lot of times these community-based schools are often run in a way where education is informal. This means that you can go through years, 5 to 8 years, 10 years of education and yet graduate without a certificate, right? So what's the point of education in the first place? One might question. Second of all is affordability. A lot of times these community-based schools, they need to charge a fee in order to be sustainable. But the fee ranges anywhere between 120 ringgit to 180 ringgit. If you go to private international schools meant for refugees, it can go anywhere between 600 to 700 ringgit per semester, depending on which grade you're in. And a lot of times, refugees in Malaysia earn minimum wage, right? So that's affordability is another concern. The third concern would be just access to these schools. Our train systems and our public transport systems are not integrated enough to allow refugees to get to school, right? So when a lot of times, when you do the calculations, it makes sense to kind of keep your children at home rather than put them in school because you can't afford school fees at the end of the day. A lot of times, refugees, we get an influx of calls, from families telling us that like, hey, my children can't afford school fees. What do we do? So it is, I think there's so much barriers in place in just even accessing informal education, what more formal education for refugees. Yeah.
Thank you. So another angle that your work has in common, the work of the both of you has in common, is also entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Could we hear a little bit more about that?
Yeah. A plug, the top that I'm wearing, it's made by some of the refugee women that we work with. What are the reasons? I mean, Malaysia, just being a non-signatory to the Geneva Convention, once again, it means that refugees in Malaysia can't work formally. A lot of times they work informal jobs in Malaysia. They work as janitors, they work as construction workers, they work as storekeepers, they work in hawker centers, right? And they earn close to minimum wage. So what are the reasons why refugees focuses on entrepreneurship programs for the refugee community is so that we can, I guess we do it in hopes that they will be able to find ways to self-sustain themselves, right? Because when you go out and try to enter the workforce outside, a lot of times there's so many challenges, challenges in exploitation, challenges in abuse. A lot of times, these tops are sewn by Burmese women. A lot of times women end up staying home and not going to work. Number one, for cultural reasons, because they're so used to doing that back home. But secondly, it's who takes care of the children then. Childcare is so expensive, right? Childcare is anywhere between 400 to 600 ringgit a month to care for children below 3 years old. And if you're only earning 1,500 to 1,800 ringgit, it doesn't make sense to keep sending your child to childcare because it doesn't pay off. So a lot of times the women get stuck at home in a cycle where they have to stay home to care for their families, to care for children. And what happens to the refugee community then? So we focus on entrepreneurship programs in hopes to be able to help these women integrate better socially, to pick up skills or to just further enhance these skills so that they are able to financially support their families.
Well, I think Heidi touched on all the important points pretty well. But again, just to add on to that, as an aspiring entrepreneur myself, I do believe in the power of becoming self-sustaining, and just perhaps a flashback to those programs that we mentioned we've been running at the ACC, at the Afghan Community Center, are a series of vocational and upskilling trainings that we have managed to conduct and set up for the community members, with the hope that they can obtain skills and knowledge which would allow them to become self-sustaining, given the circumstances and the situation. At the moment, mostly the programs cover blue-collar skills. We are focusing on wiring. We have a program on tailoring, but we hope that as we continue doing what we do, as we basically progress on this journey, we would be able to further expand these opportunities and perhaps open up more training opportunities for the community.
Yeah, maybe just speaking to that a bit more as well is that, these entrepreneurship programs isn't just to meet the labor gap in a market, to ensure that those that can't work are able to find jobs. A lot of times, our focus in running entrepreneurship programs also is to help the community discover ways to express themselves. For example, the bunch of ladies that we've been sewing with, they find, just given the amount of trauma that they go through fleeing their country to seek safety, a lot of time they find healing in just being able to work with their hands, in creating new pieces. Some of the folks here visited Agape Mission School as well, where they crochet. One of the core Burmese ladies that actually teach crochet, that started a whole crocheting initiative. She now runs a different learning center. And interestingly enough, she is teaching crochet to kids with autism. Right, and she's just slowly learning that, hey, there's so much healing that's found in creating art and learning skills, and I think really learning to present and put yourself out there as well, because often when you enter the workforce here in informal industries, you're just told what to do, right? You don't have an agency of choice. You don't have, and a lot of times you're just limited by what you can do in informal industries. You go in, you listen to instructions, and you gotta do your job. But going into entrepreneurship allows you to express yourself differently through different creative methods, and I think it's quite incredible just seeing how different ones for the community come to self in that sense, in realizing that, hey, I'm so much more than what I thought. I can do so much more than what I thought I could do. Yeah.
Thank you. So I have a few more specific questions for each of you. Amir, will you be willing to tell us a little bit more about your work specifically with Afghan refugees in Malaysia, how Afghan refugees are perceived, what kind of awareness there is specifically about this community, as well as what are some of the challenges that you think this community in particular is facing or that are afflicting this community the most?
Well, the Afghan refugee community is not usually one of the names that come to mind when we discuss the topic of refugees in Malaysia. And I think that is partially due to the fact that they form a much smaller group of refugees compared to other nationalities. For instance, according to UNHCR, as of May 2023, there are some 181,300 refugees and asylum seekers registered with UNHCR Malaysia, out of which about 157,000 are refugees and asylum seekers from Malaysia, from Myanmar, sorry. Now, again, according to the data, the Afghan refugee community consists of only about 3,000 people registered with the UNHCR. And as a result of that, I think I would say they attract a lot less attention and are one of the least, basically one of the names that don't often come to mind when discussing the topic of refugees in Malaysia. However, again, being I would say a member of the community myself, and having worked on a few different projects and campaigns related to the community and involving the community, I think some of the main challenges that the Afghan community faces is also shared with other refugee communities in Malaysia, more or less. These include things like the language gap, the inability to communicate in either Bahasa Malaysia or English. Other issues include not having access to education for the younger ones, not having the right to legally be employed, or something that has recently been the focus of attention, not having access to many medical treatment options. Now, again, some of these are common among the bigger refugee community, but some of the more specific ones would be the difference in, for example, the culture shock, or the difference in the cultures when it comes to the Malaysian culture as a whole and the Afghan culture. Again, I think Malaysia, being the country that it is, with the multi-racial and multicultural aspects of the country, I think it's easy for the Afghan community to somehow blend in. But apart from blending in, is that I think the main issue, which is a little more specific to the Afghan community, would be that integration part. Well, you could try to blend in, but can you actually connect with your neighbors, or with those who you work, or those who you see on a daily basis? Now, again, local integration is one of the things that we've looked into. We've scheduled a few dinner nights. We call them as informal dinner dates, where we invite some of the local residents of the buildings, which the majority of the community live, to come and share local food as well as stories, as a way of enabling basically Afghans and non-Afghans to kind of get a better understanding of each other.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Heidi, so Refuge for the Refugees. You've mentioned the focus of the center on education. We've talked about entrepreneurship, but you're also quite active in healthcare.
Yeah.
And healthcare access. So this is actually a double question. The first one is if you would be willing to share the main challenges in the healthcare field and in accessing healthcare of the communities that you're working with.
Yeah.
But if you could also, after that, elaborate a bit further on, what led you to focus on these three specific issues: education, healthcare, and entrepreneurship, and how you manage to combine these three fundamental but quite challenging, each in its own fields.
Yeah, definitely. I think just, like some of the barriers in refugees accessing healthcare would be finances, right? A lot of times, as Malaysians, we go to public hospitals and we get to pay government rates where, healthcare then becomes accessible and affordable. But a lot of times healthcare is not affordable for the refugee communities. A lot of times when they go to public hospitals, which is supposed to be a cheaper option between public and private hospitals, they get charged almost like a foreigner rate where it's extremely expensive and unaffordable. So because of that, and because sometimes there was a seasonal point where whenever refugees go to public hospitals, they stand a chance of being reported and then arrested, right? So the fear of just being arrested whenever you show up at public hospitals to seek access to healthcare is very real. For these two reasons, a lot of times, refugees struggle to go to the hospital because they can't afford it or they might get arrested. And we see it across, we see it spanning across these issues, right? A lot of times they wait until, because healthcare is so inaccessible and unaffordable, they wait until the very last minute, until they're extremely sick and they're in dire conditions before accessing healthcare. So some of the challenges that we see in this area, would be just how do we work around a system that allows refugees to get more access to healthcare, right? How do we ensure that it's safe for refugees to access healthcare? How do we make sure that they're accompanied by a local to advocate for their rights when you're seeking healthcare? A lot of times, we've heard of stories where whenever they turn up at hospitals, they get turned away because they don't have the deposit to put down in order to secure an appointment. It's not just secure an appointment, right? Imagine if you're extremely sick and you rock up at an emergency department and you need to see a doctor. A lot of times what's asked from refugees would be, can you put down 1,500 ringgit? Can you put down 3,000 ringgit first? And they don't have the money in advance. And this limits them from seeking access to healthcare. This limits them, this stops them from going to doctors. Secondly, it's language barriers, right? A lot of times, because, government hospitals are often worked and understaffed, there's no translators that are available to even just help you explain what's going on. And so there's frustrations in every level, when refugees can't explain to you, what exactly is going on in their bodies, what problems they might be facing. And so because of that, they get turned away as well. These are some of the limitations to healthcare. What Refuge for Refugees does in response is that we partner with a clinic in Petaling Jaya, where we pick up refugees around the area in the KL region and send them on a weekly basis. Whoever needs help, a weekly van will come and pick people up and bring them to a clinic where they get access to healthcare that feels safe. I'm not sure if many of you have the experience of just the fear of seeking healthcare, right? What if you get screamed at? What if you get turned away? A lot of times, just the bad experience of seeking healthcare and that fear that's accompanied tends to deter them from seeking healthcare. And then we see the impact of that, women giving birth at home and dying from childbirth at home. Till today, refugee women and migrant women still end up being forced to give birth at home simply because they can't afford hospital bills, right? Simply because of the fear of going to the hospital in case they get arrested and detained, because they either have relatives who have experienced that or they've read about that in the news. The second part of your question would be just how do we then juggle? Why do we focus on healthcare, education, and entrepreneurship? We focus on that simply because we believe that that is a human right, right? You can't be a foreigner in a country without having access to basic healthcare, basic education. A lot of times, refugees are in Malaysia anywhere between, sometimes the average length, I think it's anywhere between 10 to 15 years. Globally, only 0.01% of refugees ever get resettled, right? This means that they kind of go through this entire transition period in Malaysia without access to healthcare and education. And what are the impacts of this? I'm currently doing a PhD research study on just access to education and the impact on mental health for refugee children, right? And imagine fleeing so much trauma, but not having access to education, not having access to just room to grow, room to meet different ones with shared experience. Imagine being, cooped up and segregated from everyone else, despite being in a country for a long term. So we see in the long run, right, the lack of access to education truly impacts mental health for children, right? And we need to do something about that. We need to do something about increasing access to education for children, just to find ways to help them cope with their mental health. In regards to healthcare, it's really just a basic right for everyone. I mean, it's really, imagine, I often wonder what would happen if I'm visiting in a new country and I fall extremely ill, and yet I can't afford healthcare. What happens then, right? So healthcare is a basic human right for everyone. And entrepreneurship, because we truly believe in the importance of creating a space. I think we often talk a lot about empowerment for the refugee community, but I'm slowly realizing, or as an organization, we're slowly realizing that the community doesn't need to be empowered, they need to be emboldened, right? And what does that mean? We don't need to give power to them because they already have the agency within. I think we just need to restore that sense of agency that they already have, and that's why our entrepreneurship programs exist. Us saying that we're empowering the refugee community means that we're giving them skills, or we're giving them opportunities that sometimes can be true that they often don't have. A lot of times they have skills within them, right? The refugee communities that I work with are some of the most creative people. They design, they sew. A lot of times they get really upset when I tell them that, like, hey, I need to hire someone to paint the walls, and they tell me, like, why? We can do it ourselves, There's so much creativity within them. There's so much urgency within them. We just need to find a way to restore that. And I guess that's where our entrepreneurship program comes into place. And how we kind of juggle all these three is often finding ways that it's going back to the community and asking them, hey, what are you interested in, right? I think when we first started as a very young organization and as very young individuals, we went in just feeling like we need to align the refugee. We need to ensure that the refugee community adopted our values and what we saw was important. But over time, after spending so much time with the community, it's asking them, hey, what do you need? And they're telling us, we need access to education, we need access to healthcare, and we need to find ways to put ourselves out there. And that's how we tried to find synergies within these three functions of the organization. How do we ask the community what they need and then design programs around it? Yeah.
That's wonderful. If I may just follow up.
Yeah.
How do you manage? How does the center manage logistically? Would you tell us a bit more about the work of coordinating all of these fundamental but also challenging efforts that you're making?
So we work a lot with community leaders. So we work a lot with community-based organizations and community leaders, where the first layer of work for example, when we get referred a medical case, we often ask, hey, which community are you from, right? And usually the community leader is in charge in just finding out the first layer of basic information, right? A little bit about the family's background, about their needs, what are some of their vulnerabilities, what access to support they need, if there's a translator in place, how can we best support them, what is the long-term goal, what immediate help they need. So they do the first layer of assessing needs, just so that we can go in after to do the second layer of assessment, in order for us to kind of find ways to work around how do we problem solve your situation. So some of our support mechanisms really is making sure that we work as closely with community leaders like Amir, community leaders that run community-based organizations, because they know best what's happening on the ground, and they have the closest inkling of what support might be the most meaningful in the short term and the long term. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Amir, I'm going to go back to the topic of education for a second, because as we all heard during your introduction, and just to reiterate, you're certainly a successful student, and hopefully and likely proceeding to even more educational successes in your life at Colombia and further. Would you be willing to share a little bit of your experience pursuing education and your educational pathway?
Most definitely. Well, I think my education journey, or rather my story, is, although I would say, happy and proud for where I've reached and for what we have accomplished so far, it is also saddening to me to acknowledge that my journey and my story is more of an exception and not the rule when it comes to education for most of the other refugee youth. Now, as I had quickly touched on the lack of access to education, I think it's important to know that out of that 181,000 refugees and asylum seekers who live in Malaysia, about 50,000 of those are children below the age of 18. Now, apart from the, I would say the monumental impact that education can have on the lives of these children, there is also the bigger picture of how an access to proper education could potentially impact the societies on a bigger scale. Now, my journey, again, I think of myself as lucky because along the way, I've had the pleasure of meeting some wonderful people who have not only helped me, but also guided me and mentored me. You have my very dear friend and mentor, Mike Wu, sitting on in the second row. And while again, knowing that despite all of these obstacles and challenges along the way, we have reached a spot where I can say, well, I have completed my higher education, or I am about to complete my higher education. It's saddening to know that there are many other youth who are probably as talented as I am, or even more, but they simply do not get that access and that opportunity that they deserve simply because of their background. Now, again, I believe education is more of a human right rather than a privilege. And thankfully, there are organizations and individuals who are working on that initiatives. But if I were to describe education and the journey of education for a refugee student, I would call it as difficult.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Heidi, would you, changing topic a little bit from
Yeah.
anything we talked about
Yeah.
so far, but you're also involved with Pink Collar.
Yeah.
And would you like to share with us about your involvement with Pink Collar and
Yeah.
what are the synergies that you see
Yeah.
in the advocacy of Pink Collar and Refuge for Refugees, particularly, of course, in relation to migration, to migrants and refugees,
Yeah.
and beyond?
Yeah. So Pink Collar, first of all, Pink Collar is an ethical recruitment agency, Malaysia's first ethical recruitment agency for migrant workers. Just to kind of put out the landscape for people who are not very familiar with the industry, a lot of times migrant workers pay anywhere between 8,000 ringgit to 12,000 ringgit, to secure a job in Malaysia, only to, only to secure a job in Malaysia, but to end up earning minimum wages anywhere between 1,500 ringgit to 1,800 ringgit, right? And they kind of go into this cycle of exploitation where, they get promised a good job in Malaysia, but they end up working minimum wage jobs. They don't get rest days. They have their personal belongings, their passport, their phone taken away from them. And they work extremely long hours for very little money. So Pink Collar really exists, to push for ethical recruitment of migrant workers in Malaysia, where migrant workers are ethically recruited in a way where they don't need to pay any fees to come over to Malaysia, and they get placed in jobs that are safe, where employers would have to sign the ethical recruitment pledge, agreeing to a reasonable amount of hours. Number one, agreeing to no delay in payments and no taking away of their personal belongings. Yeah, so that's what Pink Collar does. It's called Pink Collar because we were first established to professionalize and to formalize the domestic worker industry. This means that whenever people call us wanting to hire a maid, we go like, oh, do you mean you want to hire a domestic worker? So how do we professionalize the industry? And we do that by not just ensuring that we vet our workers. We do that by making sure that our workers go through not just hard skills, but soft skills training. So we're making sure that it's a professional, formalized industry. Because in our Employment Act, in some ways, domestic workers are not protected by the Employment Act. They're still seen as slaves, right? So that's why Pink Collar exists. So my role with Pink Collar is to look into their business expansion. Pink Collar was first established to place Filipino domestic workers into households, as domestic workers. But about a year and a half ago, Pink Collar got a grant from the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery to expand ethical recruitment into other industries and sectors like manufacturing. So I look into pushing or piloting ethical recruitment of migrant workers into manufacturing fields where a lot of times workers get extremely exploited, in farms, in factories. And so we're trying to pilot for ethical recruitment in manufacturing industries. And in doing so, I spend a lot of my time actually meeting with business owners, meeting with policymakers, meeting with Indonesian domestic workers or workers from Indonesia. A lot of times they are undocumented. They came in illegally to Malaysia. They pay agents to come to Malaysia just to understand what brings you to Malaysia in the first place, right? It was in understanding the roots of migration allows us to shape better policies to better protect workers that are coming in. So a lot of my role looked into doing research on the ground, understanding why workers end up working in Malaysia in the first place. But secondly, understanding the needs and challenges of stakeholders on every level. Number one, what are the needs and challenges of the government, right? What are the needs and challenges of businesses that are looking to hire SMEs in Malaysia, hold 98% of all jobs, right? But yet they are not able to obtain job orders because they don't meet the minimum qualifications. So when you can't secure job orders, you can't hire migrant workers legally. That's why you end up then going through illegal channels. So a lot of my role looks into researching the ground, laying out the landscape to then understand how do we first have better set of policies and protocols to suggest to the government, but also how do we provide a service that enables ethical recruitment of migrant workers into different business sectors. And some of the synergies that I see on the ground is because a lot of times refugees and migrants, because of their documentation status, they get extremely exploited, right? They end up victims of human trafficking. They end up, labor laws do not protect them. Whenever they get exploited or they get harassed, they get mistreated, they get abused, there's no proper recourse or justice system for that. So a lot of the synergies that I see in the work really involves how do we better protect undocumented workers in general, right? How do we formalize certain jobs just so that you no longer work as an illegal, but you get to work in this formalized industries that allows for better protection of your rights. How do we then educate businesses on what does ethical recruitment look like? Because we realize that people are not ill-intentioned, they're just misinformed, right? How do we increase access to information for employers to be able to hire ethically? And how do we just guide employers around, what does ethical recruitment or just the right treatment of workers, regardless of whether you're a migrant worker or a refugee worker, looks like? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Amir, I have another question for you. So, as someone with a clear passion and talent in computer science, we also hear that you are an entrepreneur. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about Renaissance AI? And in particular, if you think that there's any worthy or perhaps problematic ways in which AI could be used to pursue education further, specifically in the case of refugees or other disadvantaged communities that you're familiar with or you want to speak about?
Well, to speak about Renaissance, I have to take off my community director hat and put on my tech nerd hat. But in essence, so Renaissance AI was this rather a project of personal passion that a friend of mine and I started. And what we do in essence is that we have two projects. We have what we call the emotional facial recognition, and another project which we call the Forward project. Now, the first one, the emotional facial recognition project, is a machine learning model. It's basically a software which has the ability to recognize emotions based on facial features. Now, we have developed it. It's at a prototype stage, basically. And what it does, in essence, is that you give it a picture or a video of a human being, and it can predict the emotions that that person is portraying. Uh, in terms of, so this was mostly a project which we started because we thought it was challenging enough. But later on, as we were working and developing it, we realized the commercial applications that it could have in areas like customer satisfaction surveys, in areas like security, when it comes to facial recognition, and we've been working on that. The Forward project, again, was inspired by my passion for teaching. And what we do is we basically conduct workshops and classes for students and those who like to learn more about machine learning and artificial intelligence. Again, this started about a year and a half ago, long before the big breakout of ChatGPT and all the other AI tools. But then again, back in the day, just seeing how things were developing, we realized that there would be a significant change in the technologies. And I think to answer your questions, again, using the powers of artificial intelligence and machine learning for education, we did have a few brainstorming sessions about a personalized AI-powered learning management system, which can provide the content of each specific grade for each student. But I do believe that not only just in education for the disadvantaged and underrepresented communities, but in a more general overview, in a more macro overview, AI and machine learning would have the power of significantly changing how we do a lot of things, and also making a lot of things more accessible and basically more easier to be done.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, I might be a little bit unconventional in that sense as an educator, but I'm absolutely excited about the potential of artificial intelligence within an education system. I have one final question for the both of you, and this is emerging from conversations we were having before the beginning of the panel, which is, it is a fact of many societies in the present day that lots of important work, many efforts towards fundamental human rights are being led by NGOs and small organizations. And I was wondering if you both would like to speak of your experience as leadership figures in important institutes in working alongside any others, and what are some of the best experiences that you've had, and some of the I guess happiest collaboration stories that you can think about, versus what are some of the things that you're concerned with as we see more and more fundamental human rights becoming the realms of NGOs as opposed to perhaps more centralized or coordinated efforts.
Well, I think if I wanted to go over the happy collaborations or the projects that we've done, those would be plenty, and I think it would be a lot lengthier than we mean it to be. But I think in spite of all the challenges and the obstacles and the adversities that we discussed tonight with you, what is I think what gives me hope, or what at least works as a statement or a proof to the fact that in spite of all these challenges, there is still hope for a better and brighter future, is the fact that we are seeing an increased interest in learning about migration, displacement, and refugees. For example, the ladies and gentlemen in audience tonight who've decided to spend your Monday evening with us learning about migration and the challenges of refugees, the many great people who are working alongside and with refugees, individuals, organizations, think tanks. I think that is what keeps me motivated and also hopeful that in spite of all of these adversities and hardships, there is still a light at the end of the tunnel, or perhaps a hope to work towards.
Yeah, I think for me, in light, just thinking about some of our most memorable collaborations or projects that we've been working on, it's actually with the people at the back there, Elroy and Zening. They're looking around. Yeah, we worked. A few projects that we were, fortunate to be part of was this project called the Chin Up Project. That looked into trying to see how we could challenge the chin cession policy that was rolled out by UNHCR a few years ago. As well as a program that is currently ongoing called Dari Dapur, in translation from the kitchen, where we work with refugee and migrant communities, to kind of film them cooking dishes that represents home, but to always bring a Malaysian or representative from the local community to the table for a conversation to explore topics on migration, right? I think, one of the reasons why, this were some of the most memorable projects that we've worked on, along another project with the Red Clinic in Jaya 1, to increase access to quality healthcare for refugee communities, as well as during the pandemic, when Malaysia was in lockdown, refugees, alongside a few organizations, came together to push out food aid, grocery aid for 1,000 families on a weekly basis. And we did, instead of gathering everyone in one spot to pick up, we actually did house-to-house deliveries for every individual that was requesting for food aid, simply because it was too dangerous to come out. In order to do that, we needed cars, and being a very young group of volunteers, we didn't have enough high capacity cars to bring food aid out, because these weren't freshly cooked food. These were grocery packs with 10 kg rice, and a tray of eggs and vegetables and everything else. And when there was a need for vehicles, BMW Malaysia actually came into the group to provide us not just with vehicles, but with people to drive these cars around. So when I look into all these projects, that we have had fortunate experience to be part of, it was realizing that one of the reasons why these projects were successful in its own ways was because the community was first consulted with, right? For the food aid program, it was realizing that every individual out there then was going out with fresh food for the community. This increases contact points with the community, because you need to go out and provide fresh food every day. And people would then end up catching COVID, right? Because of the constant interactions. But it wasn't just that. A lot of food was being wasted because these communities don't have access to microwaves and fridge, right? So this food ended up being rotten. They can't keep the food. So in order to tackle the need for food, in general, we decided to push out groceries instead. And in order to come up with a list of groceries, we went to each and every community that we're working with to ask them, hey, what do the Burmese eat? What do the Syrians eat? How do we come up with a list of groceries that benefits you? So all these different projects was always, I actually learned it from Elroy and Zening. How do we consult with the communities when coming up with problems and how do we consult with the communities when we come up with just ways we can help them, right? Because in the flip side, a common challenge that we see now, and it's a conversation that we've been having in the room earlier today, is that there are rise of groups of people that want to help, which is fantastic. But a lot of times people are pushing out help in a way that they think the community needs to be helped. It's us imposing our values and what we think the community needs without even engaging them in giving feedback. And a lot of times these programs are ineffective and there's a waste of resources because we don't first consult with the communities, right? So I think what needs to be done is how do we better consult with the communities moving forward? There is a new term in the field now called accountability to affected populations, right? So how do we begin to be accountable to the populations that we're serving in order to ensure that we're serving them in ways that would benefit them instead of us serving them in ways that, that imposes our culture and our values and our expectations on them. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you both so much. So I believe that I've had the privilege of asking questions and picking Amir and Heidi's brain for an hour now. And I know that we have a room full of an excited audience that can't wait for their turn to do the same. So yeah, I will open the floor up to Q&A. And I'm happy to help pass out the microphone if needed. You have it. Okay.
So you both touched a little on like a lack of understanding or perception of refugee communities in Malaysia. I'm curious if you've worked on any programs or hope to work on any programs that focus on educating the outside community.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So maybe to answer that question first, a plug. A project that we are part of is Dari Dapur, where, it's really aimed to, if you guys are curious, I'm actually a bit shy because my colleagues working on the project are actually sitting right at the back there, but it's really not a plug for them. But if you go on YouTube or Instagram, search out Dari Dapur, a lot of it works into addressing the misconceptions that people have about the refugee and migrant community, right? Through a way that is really non-threatening, which is through food and conversations around the dinner table. So that's one of the programs that we've been working, that we get to be part of. How do we address misconceptions? A lot of times we realize that when you push out misconceptions through through formal posters or notices, just kind of trying to address these misconceptions, it's often not well received, right? Because nobody likes to tell you how you should be thinking or how you should be responding instead. But if you do it in a way that is non-threatening, like gathering people around the table for a meal, like what Amir does with the Afghan community, bringing together the locals and the Afghan community together, to exchange meals, to exchange recipes, to exchange conversations around the table, that allows for better social cohesion, I guess. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. Yeah. Sorry, there's another question.
Yeah. Good evening. I have a few questions, but before that, I would like to thank, actually, first of all, Penang Institute for organizing a topic which is not sexy and non-academic.
Yeah.
But it's very important.
Yeah.
And actually, it's in the field of more people who are interested in wanting to do something about refugees, which, as you say, is the most downtrodden group, I think, in Malaysia, and that's a really sorry blight on Malaysia's human rights record. And secondly, I would like to thank, of course, the two young, brilliant, amazing activists. Really inspiring that what you're doing.
Thank you.
But I have to say too, they're both actually from out of Penang. Interestingly, although in Penang itself, we have huge community of refugees. Just the Rohingya alone is at least 20,000.
Yeah.
And also that there are some local groups in Penang that are involved. And of course, I want to mention Joel and his late wife, who are really, really committed to doing this, and of course, people like James and all that. So unfortunately, they were not part of this conversation. But then I'm very heartened by the fact that for such a arcane subject, that we have almost 50 people here, right? And this, as I said, this is not an academic issue. So I just wonder to what extent people around here, after this would be interested to do something to actively contribute to relieving the plight of the refugees. If they do, perhaps they can get in touch with Penang Institute, and Penang Institute can get in touch with me and Joel and all that to carry things forward. Okay, having said that, I have just 3 basic questions. The first is, there are refugees, and I think they are refugees. That is basically, do you think that the Rohingya refugees being stateless are actually in a much worse off condition than, say, the Afghan, Syrian or Burmese refugees who are not stateless and who may or may not have more rights? I mean, these are more legal questions. Second, is, you all touch on very important issues of the education, health, and entrepreneurship. But actually, underlying all this, seems to me the most important problem is the lack of political rights of the refugees. And therefore, they are triply or quadruply oppressed, and they have nowhere to turn to. And to be specific, for example, is they, as you say, have no right to education, they have no right to work. So many of them work, right? But then they're completely vulnerable. It's up to their employers whether they want to pay them or they don't want to pay them. If they don't pay them, they have nowhere to go, no place to turn to. Okay, so what do you do? Personally, I do have experience with some refugees, because my part-time gardener is a Rohingya refugee, and I listen to his very many stories. Sad stories. And one of the saddest is, I mean, he can be picked up anytime by the police and harassed for money. So sometimes he doesn't turn up for work. I worry he doesn't turn up because he's picked up, and then he's put in the lockup and has to pay 300, 500 ringgit to get out. Okay, and most recently he was doing some work for somebody, and the guy didn't pay him. And I want to help him, but I don't even know how to, because I do not dare to take him to the police station, because I do not know. As you said, they go to the hospital, they go to police station, they get picked up. So my question is, do you know of, have you worked with lawyers? Are there lawyers and legal groups that, that work on this kind of issues? And how do you deal with things like what I faced?
Yeah.
Just to follow up on Marquis's very, very important point about the erosion of all kinds of rights, and particularly political rights. What's the situation with Anwar's government in relationship to the convention? Is there lobbying going on? Are ministers being met? And what kind of response is being had out of the ministries that are responsible for the possibility of Malaysia? Because without which, it's a sine qua non, without which, none of the kind of rights that you talk about in relationship to healthcare, education, still less the kind of things you were talking about, Marquis, even become a possibility. So what is the commitment of this particular reformist government in that light? Because I think they'll make a calculation, there are no votes in refugee issues, and that's, sadly to say, a very cynical situation around. And we all know, what are we doing about whistleblowing when it comes to cops and others using refugees as ATM machines? It's exactly what they do, because they know even when they do get paid the pittance, they go and get their money, they're being harassed then and there on the spot for even the small money. Yeah? And these are outrages against the most basic forms of human dignity. And people should be outraged. But, Penang is a very large Rohingya community and so on. The state government should also be concerning itself, as well as the federal government. You're very, very strongly about this.
I think, first of all, there seems to be Anwar's government seems to be responding more positively to legalizing, to giving refugees access to basic rights, first of all, starting with legalizing them, being allowed allowing refugees to work legally in Malaysia. There seems to be a positive shift towards that, both on the opposition and the government at the moment. Across parties, political parties different politicians seem to agree that refugees should be allowed rights to vote. Just a couple of weeks ago, in a KDN meeting, I think there was discussions, saying that like, hey, maybe it's time to legalize refugees and allow them to work in Malaysia. So I think that's a positive response. And I think now it's just, as NGOs on the ground, and as stakeholders on the ground, it's holding them accountable to that and working around ecosystems that allows them to understand how do we allow refugees to work legally, number one, but number two, how do we ensure that they don't end up being exploited, right? So I think just a brief answer, I think we're in a positive direction. Obviously, it would take time for proper policies to allow refugees to work legally to roll out. But I think we are almost there if the government doesn't change. So that's the hope. Sorry, I'm trying to catch on to the questions. Are Rohingya refugees more vulnerable? In short, yes, I believe that Rohingya refugees are more vulnerable as compared to other groups only because they don't have an integrated support system here. I mean, first of all, because of the documentation status, because of just their roots and the vulnerabilities in which they come from, they are more vulnerable as compared to other communities, and we do need to find a way to better support the Rohingya community here in both Penang, but across the region as well. A lot of times, what I've noticed on the ground as well is realizing that even within the Rohingya communities, there's so much segregation in that sense, right? There's no formal support networks, and there's a lot of distrust amongst the Rohingya community themselves, and so if you can't trust your fellow Rohingya community member, I think it's harder to form networks of support outside as well. Yeah. Sorry, did I miss out on a question? Yeah. Okay.
But to quickly,
Okay.
yeah, to briefly answer that, unfortunately, at the moment, there are not a lot of legal representatives or legal institutions that are representing or working with refugees. But however, there is this institution called Asylum Access Malaysia. Now, Asylum Access is basically an international group which provides legal support and assistance to refugees on a case-by-case basis. Now, again, in that sense, they are a group of lawyers, and they do provide legal advice and legal representation on different cases. But then again, even from the discussions that we've had with them, unfortunately, they are also under a lot of pressure given the amount of demand for legal support and representation. But yeah, to answer your question, there's only one group, which is called Asylum Access Malaysia.
Yeah, there are a few other lawyers around. There are a few other lawyers that are outside of Asylum Access. People are part of this legal entity called Emerbond, for example, that sometimes represent refugees, but it's far and few between, right? But what's really interesting to find out as well is that refugees lawyers can represent refugees at court, especially if they are employed but they're not being paid on time or they have their salaries withheld. They get fair representation at court. It's just, it's often the difficulties in finding a lawyer that will represent you for free, but also just access to the justice system in general. Yeah. And a lot of times refugees are hired informally, so there's no paper trail that is able to prove their employment. Yeah.
Thank you both for this conversation. Something that has come up a lot in our own conversations is going back to the education topic. How do you deal with aspiring children to want to go to school and want to get educated, while at the same time having the potential of being resettled to a different place. Because we have visited two different schools that had two different approaches on inspiring the kids. And one of the teachers was talking a lot about the lack of motivation, the lack of the kids' desire to actually go to a higher education, like go to college, because they're also thinking that they might be resettled the next month. Or, how do you deal with that when you're thinking of what educational system seems the most appropriate?
I am not very sure if I understood your question clearly, but I have two understandings, and I'll give you two answers depending on the both of them. I think the first instance on how I understood your question is, how do you deal with resettlement and the student's education journey potentially be interrupted? Now, I think a solution that some of the schools have thought of is following an international curriculum, which enables the students to either transfer their credits or whatever they've studied, or to perhaps pursue the same international curriculum, which would probably be available in the third country. Now, the second instance of your question, or perhaps the second way of me understanding the question, was the lack of desire or perhaps motivation in the students, given that they may have the perception that they would be resettled soon. I think with that, when it comes to that issue, the communities would play a more important role in highlighting that, unfortunately, resettlement doesn't happen for everyone, and somehow raising awareness on the fact that they should think more long-term while pursuing the task at hand. So I think to answer that in very simple terms would be the role of the communities in highlighting the fact that resettlement, although available as an option, is one that is one that probably does not happen for everyone and does not happen fast.
Yeah. I think it's just really understanding the roots of the lack of drive or motivation to pursue further studies as well. A lot of times they feel that what's the point of pursuing higher study, like further studies, if my future looks the same, right? So what we try to do as well is exposing them to what opportunities that could be outside. If you were to pursue your further education, how do we get them to meet with, I met Amir through a program where we got a bunch of youth from the refugee community to pitch an idea for a space that we were about to get, but they had to pitch the idea to just large corporate people, right? Representatives from BMW, McKinsey consultants, people that represented just big companies, the country manager for HSBC, for example. And in doing so, they were able to get live feedback and coaching from this, representatives. And it was really interesting because it gives them a whole perspective of what the world outside their bubble can look like, right? A lot of times they lack inspiration or motivation or drive because they feel that, like, what's the point anyway? I mean, no difference if I end up pursuing higher education or not, but how do we then show them that there is a different world out there? How do you open doors and possibilities for them?
Hi, thank you so much for this forum. My question is, going off of the education, how do you provide mental health support and education in a way that doesn't perpetuate colonial ideas? Like, it doesn't colonize the minds of students, in the sense of, I understand that, learning English is really important, and the idea of, the hope of going to the States or going to Europe is a really important hope to have and a good goal to have. But in that, kids can lose pride in where they come from, or even just like lose a sense of their culture. And how do you navigate that and try not to teach kids that, the United States is your only opportunity and you have to, completely assimilate to the culture in order to be successful. How do you navigate that really, in
Yeah.
your mind?
I think, first of all, it's really important to take an interest in their culture. So how do we be, as locals or outsiders going in, right? How do we take an interest in their culture? How do we get them to teach us, how we're not just going in to teach communities, right? We're going in to learn from them. So how do we get them to teach us about their culture, about what's important to them? I think it's so important to preserve that part as well and not try to go in and run school in English, right? How do we make sure that we balance both, learning English, but also emphasizing on preserving your culture and what's important to you. So a lot of times that's how we train our volunteers as well, right? Some volunteers come in having they come from the US, right? Or they come from France, some of our volunteers, and they come in with certain ideals. Like you can't hit your kids. Yes, you can't hit children, right? But sometimes, in the Burmese culture, they tend to tell us that like we still do discipline in certain ways. So how do we kind of navigate the balances between like abuse and discipline, right? And how do we ensure that we don't enforce our culture and our values on the community by respecting what is important to them? Yeah, so as an organization, we try to navigate these conversations, by going like, okay, hey, maybe this might not be abuse. How do we investigate and make sure where the line is drawn between abuse and culture, I guess. There's a what? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There's one group of people, the undocumented workers, and the fact that we have created in Malaysia an institution of detention centers that are terrible, like prisons over the country. And I think that's one of the really horrible stories of what is going on. Are there groups who are systematically working on these centers? And is there a plan to show how this is the most despicable kind of action that should be taken against migrant workers, particularly when we ourselves are very much a nation on migrants? Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a coalition called the International Detention Coalition, and there's also a network called End Children in Detention Network. I'm part of that network where we're trying to push for children to be removed from detention centers, and I think immigration finally agreed to that, where we are looking into alternative for detention for children, right? But other than these two groups, I'm not too sure if there are many other groups available, only because there's so little access to detention centers, even for organizations like SWACAM or UNHCR. These organizations don't get access to detention centers, right? But I know that there are groups of people trying to work directly with each of these detention centers, with the officers in there, to see how we can improve conditions in detention centers. This means working with officers on the ground to bring in doctors or healthcare professionals, right? Because it's true, detention centers are in extremely horrible conditions in Malaysia. But instead of tackling it from the top, which might take ages, how do we work with individuals on the ground or officers that are, the only reason why things are so horrible on the ground is because of the lack of resources. So how do we support these officers with access to resources to improve conditions in detention centers? While these networks that I just mentioned, International Detention Coalition and the End Children in Detention Network, work on policies and frameworks that the government can adopt to improve detention centers.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to thank the Penang Institute and both of the speakers for talking about refugees in Malaysia, because as someone who's half Burmese, I find it I'm very grateful that you have the opportunity to talk about this. At the peak of COVID, I had the opportunity to work at a school for Rohingya refugees in Johor called Cahaya Surya Bhakti. And from what I'm aware, most students who wish to further their education can only do so if they have the UNHCR refugee status. And most of the times from the students that I talk to, they only have the opportunity to continue that abroad in, like, for example, Philippines or Thailand. Is there any way they can continue that in Malaysia, in the chance that, so they're not separated from their families and kids?
Yeah. From my understanding, working closely with UNICEF, I don't think there's currently any universities or college in Malaysia, higher institutions that actually would legally recognize refugees. And this is why they end up having to go to places like the Philippines or Korea to pursue higher education. So from what we understand, I mean, the laws and policies keep changing every year. And so even refugees who study in universities like Help University, for example, in KL, or Nottingham University, they don't always graduate with a formal degree. Some of them do, which is great, but many don't as well, because universities, because of the guidelines and everything that's in place, wouldn't allow them to graduate with a certificate. That's why they end up having to go to places like Korea and Philippines to pursue higher education. Places that would recognize them formally, I guess. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, so my question, I don't know if this is on, if you can hear me. Hello? 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 Okay. Hi, everyone. It's a continuation on the education question.
Yeah.
What is the most unique initiative that you've seen put forward in community schools or schools that are educating refugees? I think either you told us directly earlier or I overheard it, that students are able to only stay in school for a variety of years, or maybe only 5 years, maybe 10, and the traditional pathway of just learning math, English, and science isn't really gonna prepare them for real life situations. So what's the most unique educational initiative that you've seen in your programs put forward?
Well, I think one of the most effective and also unique, if you may call it, initiatives that I've come across is this program called the Hyatt Scholarship Program, provided by an NGO called Fuji. Now, again, Fuji is a Kuala Lumpur-based NGO that works specifically in education for refugees. And if I'm not mistaken, they established this program 2 years ago. Now, when it comes to education, specifically higher education, there are two main challenges. The primary one is the lack of access to higher education institutions. You cannot legally be registered, or as Heidi touched on, you cannot, if you do manage to get in, you cannot sometimes graduate with an official degree. So that is the primary obstacle. But the second biggest issue is the financial side of things. Again, paying for higher education, tertiary education is very expensive, very pricey. Now, since the pandemic, there have been many universities that offer online degrees. These are universities based overseas and in Malaysia. And I think why this program was unique is because it allows these students to pursue a recognized tertiary education program with an online university, and supports them by providing them with a scholarship, which financially supports them through their education.
Yeah.
And apart from the financial side of things, the program, I think, comes with mentorship opportunities, counseling for mental health during their time of studies, and also possible internship opportunities with their partners. And I think all in all, it's one of the most unique and also practical and effective programs that has been done.
There is also another school called Dignity for Children's Foundation based in Kuala Lumpur, where they do, they put kids through the ICGSE syllabus. But beyond that, there is also a stream where the students that might not be as academically inclined get to do their internships in their social businesses that looks into, there is a hairdressing salon. So there is also a sewing program. There is a tailoring sewing shop as well, where they create products to sew. There's a cafe where students can learn F&B skills to run a cafe. So I think this is a pretty interesting alternative to education, right? Ensuring that kids that might not be as academically inclined to finish their ICGSEs can then look into building their business skills through learning, hairdressing, learning how to farm, learning about gardening and agriculture, learning about sewing and tailoring and creating products that would sell. Yeah.
Hey, Amir and Heidi, thanks for sharing so openly and honestly tonight. They're actually both very good friends, so it's a bit weird me asking this question in a forum, but I was just thinking if we could shift gears a little bit from talking about this as a systemic injustice and government issue, which it absolutely is, but to kind of bring it down onto a more kind of micro level and to build pathways of empathy with the refugee community. I was just wondering, this is actually more for Amir. I know that you shared a bit earlier on that your story is the exception, and sadly, it is a massive outlier within the refugee community. I was just wondering if you would be able to share with us, if your father was sitting in the room right now, and this was your living room at home, what are some of the embedded narratives within your community? When your father looks at what is the best case scenario for my son in this life in Malaysia under current circumstances, because the first time I ever stepped into a forum like this was actually Heidi was speaking with Elroy, and they were talking about how Malaysia sees themselves as a transitional country, meaning refugees can never permanently stay here. However, at the time, I think this was a few years ago, you said there was a refugee family that you know of, has been in transition for 32 years and counting. So the reality is you might be in transition forever. So what would your father say to you on a daily basis, Amir, or some of the embedded narratives within your community that you're also working against as they say, hey, this is the best case scenario for your future if things don't change?
Well, I think that's a very deep question. If I wanted to step in the shoes of my father, or perhaps someone from his generation with a shared background, I think what we need to kind of acknowledge and take into consideration is the fact that many of the basically the older generation, they have pretty much spent a lifetime being refugees as well. So many of them do have that idea of, well, this could take forever to be completed. But I think what my dad would probably tell me, or something that he's told me multiple times actually, is to do all I can with what I have. So again, perhaps a little context, my dad is this very traditional father figure who shows the least amount of emotions, always logical, but he's also a very, I would say, logical person, in a sense that he does have that optimistic mindset, but is also thinks very realistically. So something that he's told me many times is that, and I still kind of like reflect back on it, is that this is the life that we were given. It's beautiful, but it's not always fair. And again, one advice that I always carry with myself is I could either complain about it or perhaps do the best with what I have at my disposal. And I would like to think that I have been doing so.
Thanks a lot. I just want to understand this better. Two questions. First is, which is more prevalent among the refugee community, the mental health issue or the physical health issue? That's my first question. Second question is, if anyone here, especially also those online, after attending this talk, after hearing from you guys, are inspired to do something, how would you advise them to approach that wanting to do something?
Yeah. I think it's really difficult to comment on which is more prevalent, whether it's a physical health issue or mental health issue, because I think that both physical health and mental health is very closely intertwined, right? And if we think about it, when we think through it, it's realizing that mental health is for the privileged, right? So a lot of times refugees can't access, if they struggle to access just general health care, what more, accessing mental health care. So because of the lack of access to just being able to understand and diagnose mental health in that sense, this means that, we don't have enough studies and data that actually shows how prevalent mental health is within the communities, right? Because they kind of go through day by day trying to survive. And then, yeah, so I think it's a bit hard to comment on that. But I guess to answer your next question, but also I think I'll just maybe touch on, I do believe, we see a high number of mental health disorders or concerns within the community, right? Whether is it extreme PTSD, or extreme, or major depression or anxiety. And there's so many things that we can't pick up yet because there is not enough an opportunity to have a close look on these issues, because they're trying so hard to survive day by day that they wouldn't see it as a priority to look into, right? And they probably see it as just part of life in the first place. I guess to your next question, if people walk away from this conversation wanting to do something with the refugee community, I guess my thoughts would be, first, get to know the refugee community around your local region, right? It needs to be, get to know the refugee community within the local region, get to know them as people, get to know them as friends, and then include them in discussion as to what help they probably need. I think effective help starts from getting to know individuals as who they are beyond the labels first, and then collectively maybe we can design solutions as to what help might be most effective in the long run. How do we then listen to what the needs are and then bring together our network of resources or contacts to meet those needs? But maybe Amir, you can speak into that a bit more.
Well, yeah, I think what you suggested, getting to know the refugee communities living around you as friends and understanding the, because again, people come with their stories. So understanding someone without wanting to understand their background and the context of their lives is very difficult. Getting to know them as friends and perhaps being compassionate towards them would be the first step. But if you're I think if you are inspired to help, then there are plenty of NGOs and groups that you could reach out to depending on where you live.
Yeah. I think my last comment would be, how do we ensure that we dignify the community as we meet their needs, right? We don't want to just be shoving needs their way, needs that they might not need, needs that might not be, help that might not be relevant. How do we dignify them in the process by ensuring that they're receiving help the way that is relevant to them? Yeah.
It's not a question, but just a light-hearted observation. These refugees issues and forced displacement issues, in fact, if we look at it, it's just something that occurred after the Second World War. All right? If you think back before the Second World War, century back, people migrate from one place to another. The Chinese, for example, migrate all over the world, right? So long as there is no discrimination, there's no, even if there's some persecution and all that, But if you leave the communities alone, all right, then they can live their own ways. They can make a living themselves. They can assimilate into the communities, or they can establish their own. Chinese, for example, now because of the needs of the community and because of the emphasis on education, you see all the schools being established all over Malaysia and all over the world, in fact. The same with the Arab traders and all that. They come to Malaysia, they come to South Asia, they assimilate themselves. So long as there's no borders. All right, just over in Europe as well, before that, there are no borders. You can go anywhere. And the communities, they just assimilate, they just establish their own communities everywhere they go. But now, because of these established boundaries, then the rights comes in, then the displacement comes in, then after that, all the persecution and taking advantage of them, all this comes in. So that's why, we have a different situation nowadays. But if we can, for example, because of the enforced displacement due to wars, all right, if countries who ratify on the convention, if there are areas available for all these communities to come and establish themselves, and also they can have their own economy going, all right, without interference, giving them the rights to actually do their own education, and also giving their rights to actually establish their own mini economy, so that they can do their own thing, so that they can live on their own. So if that's the case, then a lot of these issues can be settled. So as I said, it's not a question, it's just an observation. Thank you.
Yes. I'm sorry. Sorry for interrupting your question. Hi. Thank you, so much for today. I actually have two questions. One from a classmate who couldn't come here, like Laura. Let's see. Okay. Wait. What the? Where's our question? Give me 1 second. It's right here. Okay. So, sorry. So, one thing that she has noticed is the balance and contention that exists between the need or desire to integrate and the urge or obligation that refugees face to remain secluded in their own communities. She's curious to hear your thoughts about the external factors that often, oh my God, okay. Sorry, my phone's almost dead. So she's curious to hear your thoughts about the external factors that often impose integration on refugees, either from the receiving communities, NGOs, educational environments, stuff like that, and whether you feel that integration for them is a necessity or imposition. So, if that made any sense.
Unfortunately, I am not entirely sure I understood that.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe I'll respond just really briefly on that. So you're juggling, between the need for integration and just obligations for integration, right? Is that the essence of the question? Yeah, I think essentially integration is important because without integration, there'll always be us and them, right? So integration, is important, but I think it's fine-tuning integration and trying to get the refugee and migrant community to adopt our culture and to lose out on their own identity. So how do we balance the tension of that, right? Integration is important for many reasons because without integration, that creates a divide. Without integration, communities can't be connected to one another culturally, right? Without integration, there is always, with the divide, there's more division, I guess, and division isn't always healthy. So how do we push for integration in terms of helping, and without integration, interestingly, there is more xenophobia, right? Because there is us and there is them. And when I spoke to Thomas recently, who is the current UNHCR representative to Malaysia, I asked him, Thomas, if I had a big bulk of funding at the moment, right? I mean, if I have some money at the moment and I need to channel my money towards one program, what do I do? And he says that the highest need that he sees now, which we kind of agree, is how do we combat xenophobia, right? How do we push for more cultural orientation and more integration, just so that communities are better integrated into Malaysia. And when you're more integrated, there is less of a xenophobia sentiments around it, because with integration, that also kind of combats fear-mongering in many ways, right? Fear-mongering only happens because they're seen as people that are not us. So I don't know if that kind of briefly answers your question to a certain extent. I think integration is important as long as we don't try to get communities to let go of their own culture. Yeah.
Well, I have a very different question, I must say. In Malaysia, in terms of the law, is there a distinction between a refugee and an immigrant? Because a migrant, immigrant is a migrant. Both refugees and migrants are people who have come from outside, either because they have been forced to or because they have chosen to. That's the most basic distinction. But the migrants are usually workers, and most of them are hired from outside and brought in by a contractor, whether he is Malaysian or not. So they come in with the right to work because they've got a work permit. And then there are those who do not have a work permit, the illegal migrants, but they're less numerous. But the refugees are here because they've been forced out of wherever they were for whatever circumstances, usually political or even war and violence. So what is the legal situation in Malaysia for the two? Because my question regarding all the points you've made, which are very, very valid about the education and the health and so forth of the refugees, is, but basically, do they have the right to work? Can they easily get a work permit?
Yeah. So to put it simply, because Malaysia is not a signatory to the Geneva Convention, refugees in Malaysia do not have access to basic human rights like education, job opportunities, and healthcare, right? So are refugees legally recognized in Malaysia? They're not. Migrant workers are legal. Migrant workers have entered the country legally, but migrant workers who have not entered the country legally, along with refugees, they're termed on an umbrella called Parti Pendatang Asing Tanpa Izin. Translated, which is foreigners without, people that have entered our borders without permission. Yeah.
So I believe we have time for one more question. Malika?
Hi. So I had two, but maybe I'll follow up with Heidi about one of them, but I'll ask that one first. So in relation to the integration question, I was wondering if there's any movements to have like community classes to learn the languages of the migrants instead of just teaching them English, kind of like an inverse way to get them involved in the community. And then my other question is about the pink collar. I'm just kind of wondering how they hold employers accountable and like check up on them and make sure that they're following ethical hiring processes.
Yeah. Sorry, could you maybe just repeat your first question around
sorry.
migrant workers? So could you clarify that?
Yeah, so are there any like local movements to teach the languages of the refugees to local people who just speak English or Malay? Or...
Yeah, I don't believe that there is currently any official local programs. I believe there are some classes available informally. People who are curious to learn another language might, meet with someone from the refugee community and go like, hey, can you teach me your language, right? So I think there's very few like formal language classes available, but I know that there is a lot. I mean, there is more awareness around using food. I mean, Malaysians kind of eat around the clock, right? So there's more like, now Malaysians go to Jalan Alor and eat Burmese food instead, right? There's more awareness around it. I know there's some like there's an organization now that probably does walkabouts in the migrant communities. I mean, working with just specific focal points from the refugee and migrant communities to kind of bring Malaysians to get to know like areas where refugees and migrants grew up. You know, what do their life look like? Where do they shop from? Where do they go and eat? So I think there's a bit more integration programs around there, just in exchanging culture in that sense. In your question to Pink Collar, how do we hold employers accountable? First of all, employers would need to sign this thing that we call an ethical recruitment pledge. It's an agreement to, uphold the rights of workers, following a number of, set rules and regulations and laws. But we further reinforce them by making sure that workers have access to a grievance mechanism. So a hotline, a bunch of numbers that they can call and they can report on. We do rights training with workers, so we teach them on their legal rights down to just, their rights as individuals, right? So after teaching them about their legal rights and their rights in their job and helping them understand their contract and making sure that they fully comprehend it and, as well as the regulations that employers need to uphold, we make sure that they have access to a hotline and just a bunch of numbers that they can call as well. They call, and these numbers actually link directly to Pink Collar. We have a bunch of social workers and caseworkers that will then attend to all these queries. So each and every time, regulation is violated in their contract, we then take it up with the employer. And what we do as an agency is that every time we feel that a worker is in trouble or have run into a problem, we will first, and if the worker is in trouble, we'll then make sure that the first line of response will be removing the worker from a potential situation, right? If the worker is being trafficked. But if it's not extremely dire and counseling is required, we then counsel both the client, the employer, as well as the worker.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a fantastic conversation so far, fantastic evening. But just because I have the mic, I want to take the opportunity to raise or to tackle one of the questions that has been raised by Dr. Lim, which is why didn't we have a more representative panel of speakers? We did try. I did try. I'm actually the one responsible for calling, inviting people. But you'd be surprised at how little time we actually had. This is, I think it's a combined total of 2 weeks in order to get this organized. And so that was one major consideration. And frankly, we did reach out to many of the organizations based in Penang. And they didn't respond in a positive or affirmative manner. So I'm not saying that I have an exhaustive list of those organizations, but those that we did reach out to, they did not respond. With that, again, I'd like to thank everybody for gracing our event with your presence, your attendance, and your participation. And of course, this is not going to be the last forum discussing issues of refugees and migrants and displacement. We hope to have many others after this. I'd like to thank, other than those in attendance, I'd like to thank the moderator, Dr. Bonati, Heidy Quah, and Amir Hossein, for very quickly responding to our invitations to participate. And with that, I wish you a good evening. And again, thank you very much for